What is going on, you guys? Welcome to today's video. I have a very important topic that I want to share with you guys today. Today, I'm going to be talking about the top 5 most common JavaScript interview questions that I have received so far during my job search as a software engineer. For any of you who are unfamiliar with me or my channel, my name is Zach. I'm a software engineer, a recent graduate of Hack Reactor, currently on my job search for my first job in the software engineering industry. I've had a number of technical interviews so far, as well as phone screens, or I guess as far as my technical interviews, I should say video technical interviews, due to the fact that that is just the way of the market today because of COVID and remote work and things like that. But now that I've been on the job search for about a month, I've had a number of technical interviews. And some of these questions have come up more than once in interviews from different companies, so I feel that they're fairly common enough to mention. So I really wanted to share those with you guys, as well as some of the answers that I commonly give. Alright, so the first question that I want to talk about today is, what is the event loop? Now, while I'm discussing this question, I'm going to put an illustration up here on the screen so that I can kind of talk through my points a little bit better and have something to reference here. Alright, so for those of you that have been learning JavaScript for a while now, you probably know by this point that JavaScript is a single-threaded language. We kind of get around this by being able to write things like asynchronous functions that kind of make it simulate that JavaScript can act in a multi-threaded fashion, even though it is a single-threaded language. And this asynchronous programming kind of goes hand in hand with the 3 things that make up the JavaScript event loop. And this is the call stack, the queue, and the browser API. So the call stack is, you can kind of think of in terms of like execution context, is one that's commonly used. So basically, anytime you execute a function of some sort in JavaScript, it basically adds a layer onto the call stack. And then once that function finishes executing, it will pop off the top of the call stack. In the event that this is a asynchronous function, essentially what it will do is it will add that function to the browser API that then adds it to the queue, and then it will pop off of the queue once that function call has executed, basically. So when you run functions asynchronously, this allows you to basically run non-blocking actions, right? So like for example, when you have 2 function calls right in a row in your JavaScript code, normally the second function will normally have to wait for the first function to finish executing before the second function can begin running. And this happens because of, as I mentioned, the single-threaded layer that exists within JavaScript. So getting around this would be if we made these functions asynchronous, or the first one, for example, asynchronous, then we could execute that first function and then run the second function while we're still waiting for the result of the first function to come back. And this kind of happens in a never-ending loop so long as your application is running. So again, what we'll do is we'll call a function, it gets added to the call stack. In the event that it is something asynchronous, such as a set timeout function like this example here, it will be added, that set timeout will be added to the browser API, which will then add it to the event queue, which is down here at the bottom. And then upon executing that, it will disappear from the queue, or it will dequeue itself because that action has been executed and completed, and then it will remove itself from the call stack as well because that action has been completed. Now, the event loop itself is a very in-depth topic that you can talk about for hours, honestly, but really for interview purposes, you kind of just want to give, depending on who you're interviewing for, I should say, like if it's a FANG company, they might expect you to go more in depth if they actually asked you this kind of question. But for most companies, I think that you're probably fine as long as you can give a brief overview of the event loop and how it works. So the second interview question that I wanted to discuss today is, what is the prototype chain? This is another kind of in the weeds JavaScript question that can be kind of difficult to answer if this isn't something, because this isn't really something that I feel like you come across very often in self-teaching. At least I didn't. Like before I went to Hack Reactor, I really had no idea what this was. So that's based on my own experience. Take that with a grain of salt. But the prototype chain is pretty cool, and it's something you can really take advantage of it once you understand how it works. So while JavaScript is not a typical programming languages that has
real classes
as some other language users may try to dog on you for, such as Java programmers. But anyways, so the prototype chain kind of works on the idea of inheritance and classes. If you think of it like this, right? If you created a class in JavaScript and then you use that class as a blueprint to create other objects with methods that exist on the prototype for that parent class will be accessible to the child objects. Or if you created another class using that parent class as a blueprint, such as subclassing, this is a way to kind of specialize your classes as they get more detailed. So say I wanted to create a class for a car, right? I could place a bunch of methods on the prototype for the car class. Then I want to get more specific. So I want to create another class for a specific brand of car, say an Acura or something, right? Just for clarity's sake. So I want to create an Acura class. Well, this is essentially the same thing as a car, it's just more specific. So I don't want to have to create all of the same properties on that new Acura object, right? So I could use the car class to create a new class, and then what will happen basically is if I try to access a method such as say that the car class has a method on it called move, which just moves the car, for super basic example. The Acura object, our more specific class, will have access to this, because basically what's going to happen is you're going to try and access move on this new specific car model class, and it's not going to find it, but it's not going to tell you undefined yet. It's going to go up the prototype chain to the class that created this specific class model, and it's going to find it on that. If it didn't exist there, then it would tell you it was undefined and you'd get an error, but that's not the case because it does exist, so we can access it on that parent class. And the same thing kind of happens with arrays and objects in JavaScript. So there's methods that are not really particular to an array that exist on the array object because it's basically created off of the JavaScript object as its blueprint. So when you try to access like array.keys or something that's kind of like not super common to use on an array but would be used on an object, it still has access to that method because it exists on the object prototype. So again, to put this super simply, just think of it as if you look for a property on an object and it does not contain that property, it will look to that object's parent object to find out if that property exists there. And it will continue to go up the chain until it reaches the top level JavaScript object, and it will do that before it returns undefined. If it does not find anything, then it will return undefined. So the third question on my list today is, how do you debug an error from an API call? This is a question that I only had once, but I feel that it's pretty important to answer because I could definitely see how this is a viable question, because pretty much any job you're going to be working with some sort of API call, most likely, whether you're on the front end or the back end. So it's important to understand how to debug these API calls. To be more specific, I was primarily asked for what is the first step that I would take to debug an API call. Me personally, the first thing that I do when I try to debug an API call is I open up Postman. If you don't know what Postman is, it's basically a little desktop app that allows you to make API calls from it, and you can see the results printed in the little console window that it has. This is probably one of the most useful tools in the world if you're working with APIs and trying to either see how your data is shaped or troubleshoot API calls. It's just a super useful tool and it's free to use. Definitely check it out if you've never used it before. But if you had to continue the troubleshooting process from there, once you test the API endpoint with Postman, the next thing that I would do is, if I'm getting the data back correctly in Postman, then I would assume that I have made some sort of error in my front-end code because, well, this is presuming that the error is that I'm not seeing my data in the client. So once I test it with Postman and I see that I'm getting my data correctly from that endpoint, I would then probably go towards the front end and look at where that call is being made to, where that data is supposed to show, make sure that I'm trying to access that data correctly, or access the correct properties. If there's not any issues on the front end, then perhaps the API call was made incorrectly on the back end, and I can go and look at that. Or if this is like a production level code base where I'm a front end engineer, then I would probably reach out to a back end engineer and be like, hey, can you check out this API call on the back end and make sure that this is working correctly from your end and being passed on to the client. Because with API calls, there's kind of a lot of places where things can go wrong, and it could be something as simple as a typo. So you really just kind of have to work your way through that request response cycle all the way from Postman to the front end to the back end, and just kind of check all of your points where that call is being accessed from and try and find out where that disconnect is at. All right, so question number 4 is, what is event bubbling? This is an issue that a lot of people have probably come across at one point or another when building a small application or project. I know that I come across this a lot in earlier projects that I did before I really understood like what the issue was. So event bubbling in a nutshell is essentially when you try to call a event handler on a child element, that event call will bubble up to the parent element of that child object, or should I say that parent node, since this is HTML elements. Essentially, the where this becomes a problem is when you try to, in your code, you try to add event handlers like say click handlers and things like that to nodes that will not exist at the time that the page loads. So for example, say that say you have like this little mock-up Twitter app, right? Say you add a new tweet to it or something, and then you try to click a like button on it. If you just have your but say you already had like some preloaded examples, right? And you added event listeners to all those. Your event listeners will work on all those ones that existed at the time that the page loaded. But if you try to click the like button on this new one that you added to the list after the page was created, say you had some JavaScript and you added it to this list and dynamically created that node, it will not work. And basically what's happening is that click handler that you made does not exist on this new node that was created after the page load, because JavaScript doesn't know to add it to it. It doesn't know that it exists at that time. So the way to get around this is to add your click handlers to the most common parent nodes. So say if you have like a bunch of list items such as tweets, for example, right? You could add this click handler to whatever div those are contained in, and then reference those nodes by like an ID or a class name or something like that, so that all of those child elements will have access to that event listener. So the 5th and final question that I'm going to talk about today is, what is hoisting? Hoisting is a pretty important topic to understand in JavaScript, because if you don't understand how this works and your code is all over the place, you're going to run into a lot of errors and you won't get very far. So in JavaScript, it's kind of weird when it comes to variables, because variable declarations are hoisted, if I recall, but the assignments are not. So if you have a variable declaration and assignment anywhere in your application, if you try to access that variable before the line in which you have it on, you will get some sort of error, basically that variable does not exist. If the actual variable is declared somewhere, then you'll get most likely an undefined error. Well, not an error, but you will get undefined for that variable because it was created, but it was not assigned to anything. The actual assignment does not take place until the execution of your code actually reaches that line in your code where the value was assigned to that variable. So if your variable assignment doesn't take place until line 20 in your code, anywhere before that variable does not have that value. So you have to wait until then before you actually try to access it, or you're gonna run into a bunch of issues. When it comes to functions in JavaScript, functions are hoisted. So this basically means that you could define a function all the way at the end of your code, but you could access it at the very beginning of your code, because the creation of that function is pretty much like the first thing that happens when your code runs. and it'll be hoisted to the top and you'll have immediate access to it. So you can actually call functions before the line of code where they're declared. There is kind of a difference though between that and when you think of functions that are saved as function expressions or functions that are assigned to variables, because these are not hoisted because they are still technically variables or saved to variables. So it has to be like an actual function declaration for it to be hoisted. That pretty much wraps up what I have for you guys today. Those are my top 5 JavaScript interview questions from the interviews that I have had so far. I hope that you guys found this video helpful. I hope that there was some value here for you. Anybody else who is on the job search right now, I wish you the best of luck, and hopefully you nail these questions if you happen to get them. If you did enjoy this video today, please be sure to hit that like button right there, and if you're interested in seeing more content like this, let me know in a comment below any other questions you may have, and I will see if I can get some answers to those for you guys. Other than that, smash that like button, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you guys next time.